senior research fellow at Oxford University's Pembroke College. The country is on the tipping point of famine. We could have said that a year ago, or perhaps 2 years ago, or even 3 years ago. But the reality is that despite the consequences of that, if we were able to say a state of famine now exists in the country, that would focus minds in the region and indeed around the world. But we can't say that because we can't pin down the data because the country's sealed.
Yes, that's exactly the problem here. In fact, we're always hearing that Yemen's on the brink of famine, and yet it never seems to have an actual famine declared that would focus minds much more sharply. And the problem is that it's impossible to access the data required to actually declare a famine. Now, we have managed to stave off famine in the past by very generous funding, very generous aid, before COVID, in times when governments were still willing to give aid. But at the moment, we can't declare a famine because there's not enough data, although we can see that children, that civilians are starving, and at the same time, aid is being dramatically cut. It was astonishing to see at the beginning of March that the UN appeal for just under $4 billion didn't even reach half of its target.
And are the people of Yemen maybe waiting for a touch of clarity here from countries that have got more leverage inside Yemen than other countries have got? And yet we have to offset that against the reality, which is that so many countries, they're not turning their back on Yemen, but they are turning away from Yemen.
I think the reality is just as bad as Afra has described. But the reality for potential donor countries is that they do have their own concerns to worry about. And Yemen is just slipping down the agenda. We hate it. We think it's wrong. But that is the reality. Now, what I might say is that if they cannot stump up the aid that's required, then at least they could stump up a bit more political will to solve the crisis in Yemen. Because, of course, no matter how much aid you throw at Yemen, it's not going to actually solve the underlying problems. It's a bit like trying to put out a wildfire with a bucket of water. You can keep the flames at bay, but ultimately, it's the war that needs to end. And everybody recognizes that now.